to process. Okay, I hope it has gone online. Let me have a look at. Yes, we are on. Yes, we are on. So you can start now, Bichinder ji.
Now, welcome to ASHA Australia in collaboration with the Indian Lions Club. It's the first time we're doing the collaboration and the live on the Facebook. And what better way to spend a rainy, cloudy, grey afternoon, just then better than talking about the mind, which we all needed. And today we are very fortunate. We got Dr. Mohita Chaudhary, and I'm going to welcome Sunil ji, who's the secretary for the Indian Sydney Lions Club, to please introduce Dr. Mohita Chaudhary and enjoy the afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Bijinder ji. Dr. Mohita Chaudhary is a very knowledgeable and talented psychiatrist. She is clinical director at Concord Hospital and Royal Prince Alfred Hospital. She also practices at St. John of God Healthcare, Burwood. Dr. Mohita has got extensive experience in general adult mental health, anxiety, depression, and mood disorders, and also drug and alcohol addiction. So Dr. Mohita, you are very welcome in our meeting today. So over to you, Doctor. Sorry, Dr. Mohita, she's on mute.
I have requested her to unmute herself. Doctor, we can't hear you at the moment. I've sent a request. Can you unmute yourself? Beautiful. Now we can hear you.
Sorry about that. I was just saying thank you very much, everyone, especially Sunil Bhaiya. That's how I refer him. And it's a pleasure to be talking about a happy, healthy mind. As you would see, that's the title of my talk today. I understand that it was primarily meant on depression, but I've tried to inculcate few things in this. As we go along, if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer that, but we'll try to get through the slides. So just to begin with, I think I've tried to include what mental health professionals look like and what they mean. I guess in our journey with mental health, a lot of times we struggle to understand where to seek help and who to go to. So there are a variety of professionals that you can seek help. Obviously, most of us would know that there are psychiatrists. And being the psychiatrist myself, it's a little bit strange, but a lot of people don't know who should understand that we are medical doctors who've done training in medicine and then have obtained expertise in mental health. In Australia, you can see a psychiatrist in a public hospital, in a community health center, or in private setting. And often there is a GP referral required. I think one of the things that's important to cover is the financial burden of seeing a psychiatrist if you're doing that privately. So there is a huge amount of Medicare rebate that covers that financial gap. There are other professionals. Obviously, your GP is the second most important person when it comes to managing your mental health. Many a times you start your journey with your GP. They then understand whether they can manage it or they need to refer you to a psychiatrist or to a psychologist or just to a community mental health team. Also, we have one added benefit in this country, that is the Medicare again allows something called as mental health treatment plan, which a GP can fulfill for you and refer you to a psychologist with either no fee or a very minimal gap fee. Then I guess when we talk about psychiatry, psychologists, they carry a big burden of managing outpatients. Psychologists are not doctors and they're not able to prescribe medicines. And you can see a psychologist without a referral. Like I mentioned earlier, most of the time, your GP can refer you to a psychologist without a mental health, with a mental health care plan, but you can also see a psychologist without a GP referral. There are some other mental health workers, especially if there is somebody that has chronic mental health issues, they are often linked to a community mental health team, which operates usually on a multidisciplinary team model and can have any of these mental health workers. There could be a trained nurse, there could be a care coordinator, also known as a case manager. A case manager can be either a nurse or a psychologist or a social worker or an occupational therapist. I guess, like you can see from the slide, there are other people like occupational therapists, then culturally appropriate mental health workers. Then there are therapists that help us to look or navigate through relationship problems or family dynamics or any issues around that. In schools, most Australian schools have school counselor. Something that's very unique to mental health services is a peer support worker. So this is something that's been introduced in Australia around 6 years ago. So peer support workers are people who have themselves got mental health diagnosis, and they work with patients to understand their experiences and provide them lived experience advice. Social workers play a very important role in mental health, and few other doctors that work closely with psychiatrists are geriatricians or pediatricians or neurologists. I think I haven't written about neurologists here. They manage people age appropriately if it's an elderly or a children, and look at various issues like ADHD, autism, behavioral and developmental problems, dementia, and other cognitive issues. So now I'm going to talk about depression. A lot of these slides, they might have a repetitive content, but I've tried to put it in a language that would be mostly understandable to all of you. I guess one of the important things is, what is depression? A lot of times people say, oh, I have had a massive loss in my life. I've lost a partner, or I've sustained a massive financial loss and I'm very sad. So they come and see you and they're like, okay, give me pills, fix me. I've got this problem, so I'm depressed. And I think it's really important to understand that's not depression. Depression is a medical illness that makes person sad or unable to enjoy things despite, going well in life, or they might have adversities, but these are symptoms that can be present without any prominent cause, and they can last for weeks at a time. Most common symptoms of depression are having no energy, being irritable, issues with sleep, and in severe cases, people struggle with thoughts of self-harm and suicidality. People who were highly functional, doing really well for themselves, they unfortunately just are unable to cope, and they stop being good at their job, study, or looking after their family or anything. It's an important thing to understand that it can be a short-term illness and it can occur throughout your life. You can recover from depression and then get it again. So who gets depression? I mean, like if we would know this is the person that will get depression, you might preempt their treatment or do things differently. But unfortunately, it's hard to predict. Anyone can get depression. It is very common, and on an average, more than 1 in 5 people will have depression sometime in their life. Most people are over 20 years old, but recently with the changing parameters of world, children as young as 9 to 10 can also develop depression. Interestingly, women are twice as likely as men to get depression. But what is important to understand is that men have a more severe course of illness. People who have other mental health comorbidities like mood disorders, like bipolar, in which they can have manic illness, anxiety, personality vulnerabilities, or psychosis or schizophrenia, are also quite prone to have a depressive component. So what is the nature of the illness? A depressive episode often builds up very gradually, but there are times when it can be sudden. I think, like I mentioned earlier, that it is episodic in nature. If untreated, these episodes can typically last for several months. And even with treatment, it can take a couple of months to get to full recovery. 50% of the patients experience further episode of depression in their lifetime. Where if you attain treatment, there is a chance of getting depressive disorder again, but the chance becomes much lesser. So in psychiatry, we try and divide depression depending on symptoms. We follow like the textbook guidelines to indicate what classifies what form of depression. So as psychiatrists, we generally like to stick to 6 major types of depression. So the most commonest one that we hear in day-to-day lives is something called as major depression. This is a type of depression where somebody has had symptoms for at least 2 weeks at a time, and these symptoms are significant enough to interfere with their day-to-day functioning. This is further classified as whether it's mild, moderate, or severe. Then second form of depression, which we don't see much these days, is called persistent depressive disorder. It's also called as dysthymia. This is the type of depression which has all the features of the major depression, but on and off these symptoms can last for at least 2 years or about a year in children. So premenstrual depression, which is also called as hormonal or premenstrual dysphoria. So as the name goes, this is when women feels extremely unhappy, irritable, or moody just before her monthly periods. And the symptoms go away after her periods start. This is explained by a scientific methodology with hormonal surge. Because of the hormonal imbalance, women start to experience this form of depression, and once they have their periods, the hormones settle down and their depression improves. One of the most difficult forms of depression to treat is perinatal and postnatal depression. I guess when I say most difficult, this is the kind of depression that is quite scary, and the risks are quite high. Especially lots of research has indicated that if these are not properly treated, this can easily lead into a psychotic disorder, and unfortunately, it causes a huge burden in a relationship between a mom and an infant. So whenever a woman has symptoms of depression during pregnancy or after giving birth, it should be taken really seriously. One of the other uncommon form of depression is called atypical depression. In this type of depression, a person oversleeps, always complains about constant pains, feeling of heavy limbs. They put on a lot of weight, they eat quite a lot. It's often thought that their lifestyle is not good, that's why they are depressed, but it could be independent of a bad lifestyle. Then one of the other commonest forms of depression that we see in Australia is seasonal patterns of depression. So this is basically more common in countries like in Northern Hemisphere, where we experience longer nights and low levels of sunlight. So this leads to a depressive disorder in months of autumn and winter. In Australia, we say that around June is the time when this becomes more prevalent here. So what causes depression? Just after this slide, I have another slide that explains this in length. There is no single cause of depression, but we try to study it in a form of what is called as a biopsychosocial model. So I'll go to that slide first. So we look at biological, psychological, and social factors, and these 3 Ps, predisposing, precipitating, perpetuating, and protective. These are the 4 common Ps that we use to study what are the reasons for someone to develop depression. And I think if you look at it, it's quite self-explanatory that any person who has underlying vulnerabilities, like if they have a family history, if there is any comorbid physical illness, they unfortunately are more exposed to developing depression. Similarly, unfortunate circumstances, both psychological and social, make you more predisposed. in psychological, we look at people who have anxious avoidant personality traits or dependent personality traits, people who constantly ruminate, lot of negative thoughts, social status, poor economic social status, lack of education, lack of support from family. These things predispose you to develop depression. Then what we call as triggers, if somebody has an underlying vulnerability and unfortunately they have a comorbid substance addiction, that puts them at a high risk of developing depression. And life events or environmental factors contribute to that. People can get better, but the maintaining reasons are ongoing substance abuse or poor coping strategies. Protective factors is if somebody has no family history, they have a good employment status, good coping strategies, and good social support. We say there is something called as FRAMES model. As the name goes, F is finances, R relationship, A accommodation, M marriage, spouse, partners, E employment, and S supports. If person has this FRAMES model, their chances of doing well with any form of mental illness are much better than, unfortunately, people who don't have these supports. Some of the common reasons for depression, which I think I've covered in the previous slide, are stressful life and stress and life problems, traumatic life events, grief and loss, loneliness, not sleeping well, health problems, smoking, lack of physical activity, unhealthy eating, use of illicit drugs, alcohol or other illegal drugs, and unfortunately some medications for treatment of various medical problems can cause depression as well. So what are the symptoms of depression? How do we pick that somebody's suffering from depression or not? I think, like I said earlier, that there are times we all struggle with things in our life, and all of us sometime in our life will not feel happy about one thing or the other. It is really important to differentiate that as not depression. Depression is where it interferes with your ability to function, your ability to do things that you enjoy, ability to not think clearly. There's constant confusion, brain fog, and these are the early symptoms of depression as well. In elderly, a lot of the times people start to confuse depression with dementia, which we will talk about a little bit later. Some of the unusual symptoms which happen in about 5% of the people are symptoms of psychotic illness that come along with depression, like losing touch with reality, perceptual abnormalities, hearing things, seeing things. And one of the other components of depression is chronic fatigue, tiredness, constant pains and aches in the body, which are not explained by other things. So I think in simple language, I put them as that these some of the ways to look at depression are feeling sad or down, not being able to enjoy things, often thinking about negative stuff, ruminating, death or suicide, eating too much or not eating. This is confusing, but gaining or losing weight or sleeping more or less sleep, these all are common symptoms of depressions. Having no energy, getting tired easily, not able to concentrate or think clearly, feeling bad about yourself, lots of hopelessness, unable to see future. And like I said, that sometimes it's mimicked with dementia. That's because your ability to walk or think properly becomes very slow and you are constantly irritable. So how do we treat dementia? Basically, treatment of dementia depends on various factors. A, your attitude to your illness. B, your preferences, whether you are somebody who would go on to medications or would rather stick with psychological treatment. One of the other things that's quite important is to understand the severity of your illness. Is it a mild episode? Is it severe? Comorbid, personality, and substance abuse, they all play into picture when you're formulating a plan for depression. In simple language, you divide depression depending upon the severity of the symptoms. If it is a mild depression and somebody is able to work with a psychologist, the usual course of treatment is psychological treatments, which we say as talking therapies. And medications can be avoided if somebody is able to participate in these therapies. Then moderate depression is usually a combination of both psychological treatment and medications. And severe depression is use of antidepressants and sometimes other forms of treatment, which are stimulation treatments, which I've discussed later in the slides. So this is the model that I kind of follow with most of my patients. If we look at the model, the model indicates the alternatives. The main aim of any form of treatment is to return to, baseline and sustain functional recovery, and then be able to work and as your pre-morbid capacity. A lot of these might not come into play when somebody is quite unwell and are not able to make a decision for themselves. But the usual course is that you start with lifestyle changes, look at some psychological interventions. If despite these strategies, things are not working, then you move to the step 2, which is use of medication and combination of the previous strategies. If these are trial, things are not going better, then it leads to alternatives like hospitalization and looking at stimulation treatments. So I think one of the most important things to understand is that the main goal of the treatment is to relieve a person's distress and cause minimal impairment, reduce the burden of the illness, reduce the impact this has on their family, make it as short episode as possible, limit the possibility of self-harm or associated risk of any form of harm. I think I've said this a couple of times that it is very important to achieve recovery to the pre-morbid level of functioning so that one is able to have a good quality of life and be aware of health issues. And obviously, to induce that, it is important to prevent reoccurrence. As psychiatrists, one thing that we do a little different from most forms of medicine is risk and calculation. I don't know how much your job trains you to do that or how much the circumstances. Sometimes you just jump in, become risk averse very quickly. But I guess what is important to understand that when somebody is unwell, when they are depressed or psychotic, risk of self-harm is quite real. So I've mentioned a little bit about suicide. About 2/3 of all depressed patients at some time suicide, and unfortunately 10 to 15% do commit research this morning that indicates that 22% of the people who get depressed for the first time, young people, they do attempt self-harm in some. So patients with depressive disorder are at increased risk of suicide. I think this is very important. When somebody starts to get better, they are more able to contemplate or work through their suicidal plan. That's because they have more energy and more ability to put their thoughts in a logical manner. So this is called paradoxical suicide, and this is the time when somebody should be watched very closely. There is also potential of harm to others. Until and unless you have psychotic features, this is low. But depressed patients do have psychotic features occasionally, and they unfortunately consider harming people who are a part of their beliefs or delusional system. And a lot of studies have indicated that unfortunately it's a close family member or a carer who gets the brunt of these delusions. Depression is treatable. Most people will recover from period of illness within 3 to 6 months. So that brings me to discussing prognosis. I think I have spoken about this a little bit, but prognosis as such means the outcome. So some good prognostic factors that lead to good outcome are if there is a mild episode and either they don't need hospitalization, or if they need it, it has to be very short. They express a good understanding and are willing to work with the doctors outside, and there is no psychotic symptoms. I guess this goes without saying that psychosocial supports, like if somebody has had a history of good, secure relationships with their parents, good friendships, good social functioning, they've been employed, or they sustained some degree of education, their prognosis is better. And I guess lack of any other mental health history, any personality problems, substance abuse also adds to a good prognostic sign. If you get an episode of depression at a later age, the chances of recovery are also higher. On the other hand, some of the poor prognostic factors are somebody who's had constant coexisting dysthymic disorder. So I think, like I explained earlier, dysthymic disorder is when you've been depressed all along for a period of up to 2 years, despite being on treatment, on medications. Use of illicit drugs, alcohol or substances, comorbid anxiety disorder, prior history, they all indicate poor prognosis. Women do get more episodes as opposed to men, but men are likely to have a chronically impaired course, a more difficult course. So we'll go back to the treatment strategies again. So like I think I was explaining that the whole idea is to get a person to a pre-morbid level of functioning. And these are the 3 commonest forms of treatment: psychological, pharmacological, which is medication, and stimulant treatments. So a lot of people, especially in our community, Indian community, they are very reluctant to try medications when it comes to treatment of depression for their children, for themselves. So this is something I use. Before we can jump into medications, you try and work with the patients to do some lifestyle changes, teach them about sleep hygiene, regular exercise, modification of their diet. If there's any substance misuse issues, you address them. Or if they are using any medications, you look at them. You work along with the family members or the patients and give them a good education about the treatments, the nature of the illness, and look at if there's any form of social support, like, Centrelink benefits, housing, employment, anything. Then you look at, this is the first step, psychological changes, lifestyle changes. Then you go to psychological interventions, which is talking therapy. I've explained them a little bit more in next slides. The most commonly that we use here in Australia, cognitive behavior therapy, interpersonal therapy, and problem solving. For young kids and adolescents, something that really works well is behavioral strategies, which is activation therapy, non-directive supportive therapy, and some form of psychodynamic. All along this process, you have to continue monitor patients' risk and their depression scores, which are looked in by use of variety of subjective and objective scorings. And at any point you feel these things are not getting better, then you come to talk about medications. I've explained psychological treatments a little bit more. I think, like I discussed earlier, for mild to moderate form of depression, we rely on psychological treatments. However, I feel it's important to indicate that it will never work as long as you are not psychologically minded. You can keep going to a psychologist for years, but if you don't really do the homework, the strategies the way they have been explained, it will never work. It is highly time consuming and also financially draining. But lot of patients do have indicated that if they work with their psychologist, they do achieve good results. So like I mentioned earlier, commonest forms of therapy that we use in Australia are cognitive behavior therapy, in this type of therapy, we try and work with the patients to modify their thinking errors. For example, anything that will lead them to react from 0 to 10, you try and break that into steps for them. Then interpersonal therapy, where you help a person to improve their interpersonal relationships. It can be personal, it can also be professional relationships. And problem-solving therapy, as the name goes, it's an ability to approach a problem differently. Psychodynamic therapy works for people who have had issues growing up with problems with developmental attachment with their family members or carers. Recently, College of Psychiatry did a survey and a follow-up of patients over 22 years, and it has indicated if somebody has participated in psychological therapies properly, these therapies can be as effective as medications. So I think there are times though that a patient might be so unwell that they don't have the capacity to participate in these therapies. So a psychologist might just say to them, look, you're too unwell to do this. Go and see a psychiatrist, start the medications, and then come back and see me. So if you are taking medications for depression, your doctor or psychologist might advise you to start psychological treatment a bit later, or vice versa, like I said. So this brings us to medications, which is primarily my forte as a psychiatrist. So antidepressants medications are used for treatment of moderate to severe depression, and they can reduce the symptoms of depressions, anything like, thoughts of suicide, lack of energy, poor motivation, concentration, sleep problems. They can be resolved with the use of an appropriate antidepressant. Antidepressant treatments are also used to treat other disorders like anxiety disorders, obsessive compulsive disorders, or PTSD. The way antidepressants work is that they alter the pathways of the chemical nature in our brain. The most common chemicals that they target are something called as serotonin and noradrenaline. So in simple language, these are happy hormones, which our brain should be producing, but due to unfortunate reasons, any adversities due to chemical imbalance, their production has been recognized by our brain as foreign. So by supplementing them artificially, we start to correct these pathways. When should we use antidepressants? When you've tried previous therapies, lifestyle changes, psychological interventions, and they haven't worked, that's when you should consider them. Use them when patient is agreeable to take them, because it's a bit commitment. Like any medicine, you need to take them daily, but antidepressants genuinely cause more harm than good if you use them a day and then don't use them. I had a lady who said whenever I was feeling more low or unhappy, I would take 2 tablets, then I would be fine for a couple of days, and then I will take it again when I feel depressed. So it really doesn't work like that. These are not like painkillers. You have to take them every day. Prior history or experience has indicated that medication is needed. That's a big warning sign. You should start taking treatment. I've written something here about effectiveness and tolerability. These are 2 big factors with antidepressants. I have addressed them a little bit more in next slide. So effectiveness of antidepressant, a lot of patients would say to you, oh, I've been taking this medicine now for 2 weeks, but I'm not feeling better. One of the most important things to understand is that antidepressants are painfully slow to work. They take about 4 to 6 weeks before you will notice any benefits. And sometimes this period is even a bit more longer because you start with a low dose and then gradually up titrate it. As opposed to other fields of medicine, in psychiatry, we still have very limited medication. So I always advise my patients, please don't change your medicine unless you've given it a good try at a good dose for a reasonable period of time. So the key is that you start them at a low dose, you minimize the side effects so that patient is able to tolerate them, and you gradually build it up give it about 4 to 6 weeks before you decide this medication is not for me. One thing which I think I said earlier, that taking these medicines on daily basis or as advised become very important, because these medicines, they build up very slowly in your system. And for example, you take them for 2 days and then don't take them, the trough level, which is the blood level of the medicine, drops down, and you start to experience what is called as a discontinuation syndrome. And you'll get a lot of not so nice effects from that. So it is very important that you should take the medications daily. So one other thing is, when you start these medications, any form of antidepressants, first 1 to 4 days or a week, you will get some unpleasant side effects like nausea, a feeling of alertness, agitation. Some people get diarrhea. That's because you are altering the chemical pathway in brain, but it does settles down. Just wait for a week and it does gets better. When a young person who's taking the medication for the first time, it's very important to monitor them very closely, because the serotonin alteration in your brain can make them suicidal. So you have to really monitor this very closely. So sometimes young people who start taking medicines can have suicidal thoughts, and you should get them checked regularly during the first few weeks of treatment. The commonest side effects are weight gain, sexual problems, sleepiness or tiredness, or lack of sleep, dizziness, agitation, dry mouth, diarrhea or constipation, nausea, headaches, teeth grinding. It can interfere with some of your other medications that you take for medical problems. And some of these medicines can induce seizures. But carefully monitored, most of these side effects can be tailored and they can be worked with your doctor. A lot of people ask that, how long will I need to take an antidepressant? Does this mean that this is going to be my treatment for rest of my life? Are these medications addictive or habit forming? So once an antidepressant starts to work, it does take a little while to work, like about 6 weeks. Most people will start to improve. And if it is a first course without any comorbidities, you really don't need to take your medication for more than 6 months. After you start to get better with discussions with your doctor, you gradually, slowly taper off the dose, and you can completely stop it within 6 to 8 months. There is no guarantee that means you are treated for rest of your life. Most people don't need to stay on antidepressant medication for years, but sometimes some people do need to stay on it longer than others because of the history and nature of their illness. I think I briefly mentioned earlier brain stimulation treatments. So the two common types that we use in Australia are electroconvulsive therapy, also known as ECT, and something that's just very new in Australia is called as repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation. For general population, ECT is a big stigmatizing factor. On the contrary, it's important to understand that it's a very well-researched, safe and an effective treatment. It works positively in about 91% of the patients. So most commonly we use ECT when there is urgency for someone to feel better, like a pregnant mother, a suicidal patient, a psychotic patient, or somebody who's just stopped to eat and drink. So there are a lot of skewed cognitions, skewed thinking about ECT, and I think a lot of this is the way ECT is portrayed in movies and all, but it is nothing like that. It's a fairly safe treatment. Repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation at this stage is only available in private hospitals because it's not on the Medicare. It works similar to ECT, but it is less invasive. You just put a hairband which attracts the magnetic field and changes the brain activity. Both these treatments, they work similar to what medications do, but at a much faster rate. So these are some steps to surviving depression and suicidal thoughts. I think most important thing is that speak to somebody. There is a lot of stigma, lot of unhelpful remarks about mental health conditions. So it's really important to speak to somebody who knows about it, a professional, your doctor, GP, case manager, or a reliable family or friend. Get help. There is, like I mentioned previously, people who are unwell, they are often referred to community mental health team. These teams, they work 24 hours. And if you are in a position where you're unable to formulate or look after your own care, they'll allocate a care coordinator, also called a case manager. It is important to have a plan with your case manager that can be instituted in the time of crisis. It's these assessment teams, they can come and visit you at your home. They can come organize for a follow-up with a psychiatrist. They have the ability to institute a plan which is called a relapse prevention plan, and you chart with them what is called as what should be done when your symptoms of depression start to relapse. We'll discuss some of this in these further slides. One of the things is you have to be an active participant in your therapy. A psychological therapy will only be as effective and successful as well as it is conducted. So if you are doing any of these therapies, please be honest with your therapist, do the work, do the homework that is given to you. You have to learn to pay attention to your mind and mood. Most of us will be able to recognize the signs of depression, and I think we should be quite attentive if there are concerns raised by our family or loved ones. Reach out to your doctors, your mental health team. Like I mentioned earlier, you need to formulate something called as early relapse prevention plan. And most of the times what we do with our patients is that you make this plan, you get it signed by them, you ask them to nominate a family member or a friend. A copy goes to them, a copy goes to the patient, a copy goes to their doctor, GP, psychiatrist, community team. And when somebody is not well, and if they are refusing help, at that stage, you have the authority to use this plan and get them into hospital or whatever help is needed. Also, a lot of times, mood diary is a good indicator how you are traveling. It helps you to look at your and monitor your own progress. Value of good diet can never be underestimated. I think I've just included different components of what we should eat. Most of these ingredients we get from our day-to-day food, and just in case if for whatever reasons you're not able to eat them, then you can look at trial of a multivitamin or a mineral supplement. Please involve your families, your partner or family member, and give them the authority to make a choice for you when you are not able to. We have a lot of self-help groups and that operate even on day-to-day basis. You can go and attend those groups. People in these groups, they benefit from each other's experiences, and they can help you navigate through times when it is difficult. Regular exercise is very important. Then I guess if you are a smoker, it's important to understand that smoking can increase the risk of anxiety and depression. One of the other things is the pathways that when you smoke, the nicotine release caters through a channel in our body. That's where the antidepressants cater. It's quite similar. So a smoker, especially a heavy smoker, will always need higher doses of medications because a lot of it is being released through their this pathway. So if people can look at reduction and cessation of smoking, that's quite important. Avoid any form of illegal drugs. When I say illegal drugs, I know alcohol is legal, but I think it's important to indicate that excessive use of alcohol is quite dangerous for your mental health. It's a depressogenic. In the moment, it might feel like, oh, this is relieving me, it helps me with my anxiety. But over the days or weeks, the impact is that it makes you more depressed or anxious, and it counteracts the effects of any medication that you are treating. So as an addiction specialist and a psychiatrist, if I have a patient that comes to me that is abusing drugs, alcohol, and has comorbid depression or anxiety, I always treat the substance misuse first before I come to mood disorder or depression or anxiety. Good sleep is really important. It releases melatonin, enhances our natural wellness. So a good sleep, especially for women, is more important than men, but a good sleep of 8 hours is really, really required. And I think it's very important to understand that you should have a good plan of regular follow-up of your physical health problems with your GP. There are a lot of internet and phone apps that are available. I've just listed some of these which are most commonly used, especially if you are looking for online CBT. These are very useful apps. It is important to remember though that some of the information on internet is not correct. So even though I've given names of these apps, I always encourage patients to discuss any of their concerns or worries with their doctors before they rely on internet. I also strongly discourage my patients to Google their symptoms and also Google the prescribed medications, because inevitably when you start medicines and if you start reading internet reviews about them, from my experience, they give you all the bad side effects, what you've read about. So I always refrain patients from doing that. And I've just put some support and information numbers from family. What we commonly use in Australia and all hospitals is a mental health access line. This is a 24-hour line, and this line has, if you speak to somebody on this line, they can organize help for you. They can triage your needs, and it can be something as urgent as within like 10 minutes. So I'll have these numbers, you can look at it. This brings me to my next topic for today. I don't know if you guys want to take a break and if there were any questions that I can address for depression, or should I move on?
Dr. Saab, can I ask one question?
Yes, please.
It is like this. I happened to listen to a talk from India. It was talk by the patient itself, a girl of around 20-22. And when she said, initially I didn't know that she's a patient. She was later on introduced as a patient. And she said, we have to take care of the patient, the friends, the relatives, and everybody. I was always doubting, if you start asking anybody, is there something wrong? Even if there is something wrong, the patient will never agree that there is something wrong. So that was my anxiety every time, that how do we handle if we see there is something wrong with a family member or a friend or a colleague? That's number one. And how do we take it further? That's because in your slide you said the patient has to be active participant, look after your body. It's possible only if the patient has really come alive with the problem. And secondly, isolation leading to mental illness like COVID. That also you may like to touch upon something.
Definitely. Look, I'll just speak about what I understand in Australia, even though I come from India. Unfortunately, I've never worked as a psychiatrist in India. I think I'll highlight something called as Mental Health Act that we use frequently in Australia. What is Mental Health Act is, it gives us, it's not right to say this, but it gives us the power to treat a patient against their will. And unfortunately, like you said, it is very hard for somebody sometimes to accept that I have mental illness. It can be a very daunting truth. You can feel very isolated in your thoughts. The world could seem like ending for you, your loved ones. For parents, they just get devastated. But I think sometimes what happens is that because of the use of the Mental Health Act, fortunately or unfortunately, you can treat them and you can reduce the carer's burden. You can reduce the potential of the episodes becoming more dangerous or more, you can delay the progression of disease, and then you can link them into appropriate sort of age appropriate things. If it is a 22 years old girl, I genuinely believe one of the most important things with any patient with mental illness, be it depression, be it anxiety, it can be quite incapacitating. It's all about helping the patient to gradually find their feet and look at next step with whatever capacity they have. And the role of the community team, sometimes more in the public system, we are quite stretched. So then depending on, what is the ability of the family, if they are able to sustain financially private health, there are a lot of self-help groups. There are a lot of age-appropriate groups. There are a lot of groups that help you to get to your potential and, and take things from there. I think you mentioned that this girl indicated that it's very important to look after the family members because they get a lot of brunt of this illness, and carers fatigue is quite real. I don't know if this answers your question.
You're on mute, Dan. Yes.
I was doubting myself that, because when she was talking initially, it was a sort of a little unprofessional talk.
Mm-hmm.
And then naturally, when later on she was introduced, why don't you tell your story? Then I came to know it is her own part. So
and look,
it does answer.
Sorry, like any other illness, I think it is difficult to ascertain whether this person is unwell or their family members are struggling. But I think as humans, we can just be kind. We can just try and, if somebody shares their experiences, offer support or offer guidance and,
Right.
probably indicate a right pathway. I think something else that you touched on was COVID and the impact of COVID on mental health. I guess it can be a whole talk in itself, but I guess this is something which we all will agree in one way or the other. COVID has caused a huge change in our mental and physical abilities to get through life. I think the mental health burden has increased quite excessively, and that's quite evident in our healthcare system. Right. But in saying that, in Australia, the Medicare has given a lot of facilities for COVID mental health issues. There is a lot of bulk billing in telepsychiatry, and I'm happy to come back to this some other time if there is a need.
That will be lovely. And in fact,
I'll suggest now.
You can go ahead on dementia.
Yeah, that's what I was going to suggest, that we have almost ran out of time, so we need to finish and we'll leave the questions towards the end.
Yeah,
thank you.
Dementia, we can continue.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Sure, I'll try and skim through this a little quicker.
Sure.
Is that okay?
And you, Sunil? Okay.
Yeah, we can see the slides. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, so I've just included dementia, considering that it's a little bit more relevant to a slightly elderly population, and maybe we all have family members who are struggling with this. So dementia is a medical condition where there is a damage to our brain cells, and this damage it's different from normal aging. The brain lobes get shrunk because of the loss of these brain cells. What is important to understand is that these loss of brain cells can interfere with our memory, thinking, and behavior. And unfortunately, dementia is not reversible. The treatment, with the proper treatment, it can be slowed, but there is no treatment available till this date that will cause irreversible of the process. It's common in people that are aged around 60, and by 85 years of age, around 1 in 5 people will have dementia. I think, like I said, it's not a part of normal aging. It gradually gets worse, and there are medications and range of supports to help person and their family who's been diagnosed with dementia. So there are 4 types of dementia. The most commonest one, which most of us would have heard of, is Alzheimer's dementia. What basically happens is like a wire, you get tangles in these nerves, and unfortunately the information gets lost because of these tangles. Then the second one, which is vascular dementia. This is called as organic dementia. This is common in people who unfortunately have a lot of medical problems, diabetes, blood pressure issues, who've had stroke, and this causes this form of dementia. Lewy body dementia is more commonly seen in people with psychotic disorders. They start to hallucinate, and the protein that causes the smooth flow of information is lost in the brain cells. Then one of the other forms of dementia, which is not very commonly seen in Australia, is frontotemporal dementia. In this dementia, the lobes of our brain, frontal and temporal, are lost, and this is most commonly seen in people who have had head injuries or sports injuries. Interestingly, recent findings have indicated alcohol use can cause frontotemporal dementia. So again, I guess it's one of a very crippling disorder. So people believe, like, how can you prevent this disease? How do we know who will get it or not? There is no way anyone can predict who will get dementia. Your genes, environment, and lifestyle play a big role. Age is a risk factor, and like I said, having a lot of medical problems like blood pressure, cholesterol, diabetes, family history, and smoking are other risk factors. Certain races are more prominent to get it. In Australia, Aboriginals are more likely to get dementia, and at a much younger age. You can reduce the risk by staying physically and mentally active, limiting the amount of alcohol, not smoking, and eating a plant-based diet. Recent research indicates that Mediterranean diets really help with dementia or any forms of mood disorder as such. One other interesting thing is that red wine, it's got an antioxidant called resveratrol. That's the oxidant which adds the color of the wine. That's said to be protective. So whoever wants to enjoy this, a glass of wine a day, they say, reduces the symptom of dementia. I guess the symptoms are initially it's vague, loss of memory, unable to remember appointments, dates. But as the disease progresses, you make more mistakes, you lose things easily, you are unable to enjoy your hobbies that you would use to, unable to keep track of any information or organize yourself. So as the disease progresses, you struggle with basic day-to-day things. There's a loss of sense of direction, even in familiar areas. You are unable to register inhibition. Like said earlier, you might struggle to remember names. You can have depression or anxiety. Some people do experience hallucinations, like they see things or they hear things. There's a massive change in your personality. Somebody who's quite calm will become very aggressive, and you can become quite disinhibited. Sexual disinhibition is quite common at a later stage. You have problems swallowing, eating, cleaning. How do we diagnose dementia? Basically, it's a diagnosis of exclusion. There is no test that will be able to rule out whether this person has dementia or not. So it really depends on series of information and examination, but early diagnosis is crucial. And a lot of times, various infections, various other mental health illness, they can mimic dementia. So if you treat them properly, you can slow the progression. So various specialists that diagnose dementia: psychiatrists, psychogeriatricians, neurologists. And like I said, there's no specific test. You do a full medical history. There's subjective scales like Mini-Mental Scale, cognitive assessment to test their memory, thinking, mood. There's some series of blood tests and brain scans that help you to see what the brain lobes look like. So what is the treatment for dementia? Like I said, unfortunately, there is no cure. Hopefully, in few years, there might be something that would come out. But a lot of the treatment of dementia really depends on treating the associated comorbidities. Something that we commonly believe helps a patient with dementia is psychological treatment, but not doing psychological interventions like CBT. It's more about cognitive stimulation, so you keep them more active, things like memory cues, word puzzles, making more familiar environment, decluttering, well-lit spaces, and a space that is more calming and non-stimulating for them. A lot of people indicates that having old photos, old music, and things that this person has enjoyed, it helps them to keep them calm. In terms of medications, most of the medications are used to aid with their depression, anxiety, sleep problems, or agitation. There is no cure for dementia, but there are treatments that can delay the progression. They have some side effects. So most important key is to start at a low dose, and then depending on what benefits you are attaining from them, keep the progression of dementia. One of the commonest things with dementia is what is called as behavioral and psychological symptoms. Unfortunately, a lot of people with dementia, it's very painful to see your own family member or a loved one who was once the most intelligent, most calm, a nurturing person, they've become very aggressive. So you have to learn to manage their aggression with the doctors. The psychiatrist can give you appropriate medications, but it's more about, just seeing what they can tolerate or not. But therapies that can help them to keep calm are very useful. We have a lot of home help and community services packages in Australia. This can include community nurse, a respite care worker, cleaning services, meals on wheels, respite by sending them to a daycare center where they have similar patients. It gives them an understanding of what a nursing home life would look like. I've put some numbers here for aged care services and full-time care services. I just thought that these would be handy. Like I said, that the carer's burden is quite huge. If somebody has a family history of dementia and they feel like, they can notice that they are not as prompt with their cognition and memory, these are few things you can do to help yourself stay active, challenge yourself regularly, stimulate your brain, be aware of signs of depression because that can be easily treated, join a support group, and start planning things for your and your loved ones like legal and financial matters. You can look at Advanced Care Australia. It's always good to have like an enduring power of attorney and all these matters dealt with. Then if you have a family member, someone that's struggling with dementia, their care needs can be very high and you can easily feel overwhelmed by this responsibility. So it's very important to take care of yourself. Reach out, speak to people, encourage your loved one to seek help, help them to put some memory cues for them, use calendars, diaries. If the person is slow in doing something, it's very, by human nature, we rush in to help them. We should never do that because that really takes their skills. And just provide yourself education about what dementia is. You can look at Dementia Australia and go through a pamphlet. It's a very non-medical terminology and a very well-written document. I guess this is the last slide that don't fob off memory problems. They are not a normal part of aging. It's very important to plan and support somebody who has dementia. There are a lot of services available. There are medications that can help with symptoms and slow the progression. And carer's fatigue is quite real, but there is a lot of support available. I think that was my last slide. Yeah.
That was very excellent talk, Dr. Mohita. I have one question, though we don't have much time, but how can we prevent dementia? Means, are there any mental exercises we can do before the symptoms, we see the symptoms, just to prevent, what we can do?
Look, I think I did mention a little bit. It's unfortunately hard to tease out who amongst us or who will get dementia or not. But if you have concerns, if there's an active family history, then it's very important to be mindful that, you know, this could be me in near future. So cognitive stimulation is very important. Some very basic exercise like word building, crossroads, just doing puzzles day to day. There is something called as BEAT program, which many Australians between age of 60 to 65 use. It's something very simple, like in our homes, all of us have lentils. So you pick up like 50 colors of lentils and then give yourself like 5 minutes to separate those lentils. So just to give yourself a bit more cognitive enhancement. If you smoke, please work on stop smoking. 1 glass of wine a day is good. Make changes to your diet, avoid sedentary lifestyle. I think these are the cues that can help people to avoid. I don't think you'll not get it, but you can keep yourself more happier and healthier and probably not get dementia if there are genes till later age.
Okay, thank you.
Nilji, it is excellent talk and giving a full field of psychologist what can he or she can do it. And it's very good. And for a psychologist, we don't need a referral.
Most
Did you
of the
say that?
times for a psychologist, you don't need a referral, but we get something called as mental health care plan, which is on rebate through GAP, and your GP or even a specialist, but most of the times a GP can put you on a mental health care plan and then you can give that to a psychologist because then they get paid through that Medicare plan.
All
But
right.
essentially, you don't need a referral. If you're willing to pay, you don't need a referral.
Are there more questions?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah. Anyone? Any more questions, please? So probably then we can wrap up if there are no more questions. So actually, sorry, is there any question? No. Yeah, so on behalf of Lions Club of Sydney Indian and Asha Foundation, I thank you, Dr. Moita, for taking out some time from your busy schedule. Indeed, the information you provided to all our listeners is very useful and everyone definitely is going to get benefit out of it. So once again, thank you. But before, I request everybody to just put their hands together for Dr. Moita.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Really
Thank
excellent
you.
talk. But
You did very well.
I'll request
Dr.
now actually 3 persons to thank Dr. Moita as well. Dr. Mangat Bansal, who is president of Lions Club of Sydney Indian. And I'll request Dr. Sundar and Dr. Walaju also, who are the director of Asha Foundation, to thank Dr. Moita. So we will start with Dr. Mangat, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chaudhary. Yeah, we had an excellent talk.
Thank you
it
so
was
much.
very good, very informative. Thank you very much.
Dr. Sundar, if you are there, so will you like to say something? No? So
I think Dr. Sundar has left. Yeah.
So what about Dr. Walaju?
Rani can do that.
Rani is there. Yeah, his wife is there.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, if you want to say something, please.
She's a psychologist of Dr. Sundar.
I'll just unmute myself.
Yeah, you gave a very good talk on diabetes.
So yes. Yes, Dr. Mohita, that was a very, very good talk and very detailed and comprehensive. And it was very good to hear your talk. And I think most of us, approaching old age, dementia is going to be there, depression is going to be there. And I think hearing your talk, we can take advance care in making sure we don't go down that path. It was very informative. Thank you very much. Excellent talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And we expect you to be back again among us for one more talk.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that would be the public demand. Actually, it was so much good and informative talk. So if we can we can request Dr. Moita on some other topic. Sure,
Correct.
definitely. I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
So that's,
Thank you, everyone. Please look after yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone. So yeah,
You, doctor. Thank you so much.
we come to the end now. This is the end of the meeting. Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.